Welcome to the Solar Loop, where we break down the biggest updates in the solar energy world and what that really means for you as a homeowner or business owner. If you want clear, reliable solar information, subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any future episodes. Welcome to the March 2026 Solar Loop. Larry and I are going to discuss really interesting developments in terms of FIOC. And then we're going to talk a little bit about third-party ownership and what you should know as a homeowner if that's something you're considering. But Larry, let's first talk about, this is exciting news, at least for us on the installer side and for many of our customers, the guidance that came out on February 12th with regards to FIOC, the foreign entities of concern, and how do we make sure that we meet those requirements for commercial, agricultural, industrial projects so that they can secure the tax credits.
Yeah, it is exciting, Warren. It's exciting to get that input from the IRS, the update, and to find out that it's not significantly challenging or significantly more challenging to comply with. And the other exciting news, Warren, as you know, is that we now have certifications as a company from manufacturers that we feel comfortable going to our customers and saying, hey, these are the manufacturers and the products you can use to comply with the FIOC requirements. The guidance is 3 weeks old and the certifications are just hot off the press. So we're excited to be able to move forward with those again.
Yeah. And this is, not to put a damper on things, it's all exciting news, but that isn't the final guidance. There still is more guidance coming.
I know we've talked about this a lot, but that's another reason to proceed as soon as you can. And one of the things I'll say is when the updated guidance comes out in the future, we'll have 60 days to comply. So that's probably going to come up close to the July 4th deadline. So let's say that new guidance comes out end of May. Anything that's safe harbored by end of July is good to go. And that's beyond the safe harbor window. So hopefully any project that we safe harbor by July 4th will be under this existing guidance and be good to go.
So let's talk about what we were hesitant about or what we didn't know prior to this guidance coming out and what we now know.
Yeah. So the one thing that we were hesitant about is how far down the supply chain the requirements would go. Would they say, well, your cell's made by a non-FIOC entity, but your raw materials came from a FIOC entity? They didn't do that. They said, hey, if the cell's made by a non-FIOC entity, you can run with that. You don't need to worry about where the raw materials came from, although the manufacturer is supposed to check on their supply chain and not use FIOC companies as much as possible, of course. But so that's good news for us. The other thing that we were uncertain about is, and there's still some uncertainty around, what is a PFE? That's not been fully defined. What is a prohibited foreign entity? And so the approach that we've taken, Warren, is go with manufacturers that are very clear. Maybe they've never had ties to China. They've been North American based or whatever. We're going with those manufacturers because we feel the most confident that they're going to be good to go.
Right. And at this point, we feel comfortable that we have enough manufacturers to quote ground mount projects, roof mount projects that'll be FIOC compliant, as well as probably meet the domestic content requirements.
Correct. Yeah, we're aiming for products that do both to try to streamline and simplify this as much as possible.
Right. So that means that right now, if that is the case, and you're considering solar, you have signed up for solar, you can, if you sign up before this July 3rd cliff coming up, secure your 40% tax credit and be FIOC compliant and have 4 full calendar years to install your project. But the timeline is short. We've got 3 months here or so until we get to that point.
Yep. And there's a lot to do before that happens.
Right. So if you're on the fence, this is the time to move. It's a great opportunity to make sure you're compliant and lock in a 40% tax credit. So speaking about tax credits for residentials, they just went away. December 31st of 2025 came and went. And the 30% tax credit for residential projects is no longer available. And so what we're seeing now are almost a sense of going back to many, many years ago, where we saw a lot of leasing on power purchase agreements on residential projects, to even more different instruments that are more creative to finance these projects now with third-party ownership.
Yeah, it's a little clunky because customers still would prefer to pay for it up front or to do a loan. In most cases, that makes the most sense for the customer because they don't only worry about this long-term lease, who owns it, all that. But in order for the tax credit to pass through to the homeowner in any sense, it has to be owned by a commercial entity. And that's where these prepaid leases are coming back into existence.
Yeah. And so just let's explain the prepaid lease and how that works. So there's a IRS requirement for in order for a business to take the tax credit, they have to own the system for full 5 years.
Mhm.
After year 5, they can sell the system and still retain their tax credit. So how does that work for a homeowner who's thinking about going solar and considering third party ownership to get some benefit from that transaction?
Yeah, so some of the leases that we've looked at, basically the way it would work is the leasing company would give the homeowner about 25% off their project. And the idea is that you can prepay your lease. So just like you said, that company has to own it for 5 years, but you can prepay that lease up front so that it looks like cash. It feels like cash to the customer. Hey, I'm paying the whole thing up front, but you still own it for 5 years and then I own it after that. The other trick with this too is a lot of customers won't have that cash up front, so they can do a 25-year loan. So you might have a prepaid lease with a 25-year loan that feels like a 25-year loan without the lease, if that makes sense.
One of the important things to look at if you're considering this option is number one, what is that loan going to cost me in terms of interest? 6% over a 20 or 25% term, you're probably paying more in interest than you are for the actual system over that period of time. But also, you want to make sure that there are no prepayment penalties. If you have the cash and you don't want to pay that interest and you want to buy the system out and be done with the loan at year 6, what does that look like?
A lot of these companies are going to have options to pay for that without any kind of penalty. That's kind of the big idea right now and what a lot of companies are going for.
Yeah. And then what if somebody's considering maybe selling their home? How does that impact the transaction?
Yeah, so you're still under a loan or a lease, and so the new homeowner still has to comply with any requirements, around debt to income ratio or any of those types of things. They still have to hit all those same requirements in order to be able to take on that lease.
Yeah. So really two things there. The new buyer would not only need to be willing to assume the lease or
hmm
assume the loan, whatever the liability may be, but they also need to be able to qualify for it.
Right, right. Yeah, and the caveat with this, and Warren, this is on an article from Solar Power World, how to communicate VPP value to homeowners. They did a really good job of kind of talking through a caveat here. If it's a third party owned solar array, so if a leasing company owns your solar and storage system, you feel like you own it because you've paid it in cash, or maybe you have it as a loan payment, but it's still technically owned by the leasing company. And in that case, the system owner, not the homeowner, has the right to any grid services revenue, from changing the settings on the inverter or maybe pushing power back out, from the battery system. The system owner, again, not the homeowner, has the rights to that revenue.
Sure. And that's something that in the sales process, they talked about in that article is not very well articulated in the sales process. Many people don't understand that, Larry. You alluded to VPPs, which are virtual power plants. And in those scenarios, if you don't own the system, whoever owns the system has the right to those grid services. Typically, if there's storage and batteries, it's the ability to sell some of that stored power back to the grid when they need it. Not all of it, but usually a predefined amount. And that revenue from that transaction would go to the owner of the system, not the homeowner. And then maybe the ability to change inverter settings or something else if they don't have storage to improve and again, if there's any revenue received, that would go to the owner of the system and not the homeowner.
hmm Yeah, and that's just one aspect of it. I mean, I want to highlight this is highly complex. I mean, you and I sitting here, Warren, we can talk about this, and I can mostly wrap my mind around it. But customers that are coming into this for the very first time, I mean, it used to be you owned it, you got the tax credit, you got any state incentives, you got any SRECs. That was still complex, but now it's like, well, who owns it? Who gets the tax credit? Who gets the state tax credit if there's something like that? Who gets the SREC income? Who gets the VPP revenue? Who gets local incentives if there's local incentives, or maybe they don't apply at all. How do you work through all that? Plus, the financing vehicles, PPA versus lease versus loan. Who takes care of the O&M? What happens if it doesn't produce what I thought it was going to? Who takes the hit from that? So there's there's a lot of complexity here. And what the industry is going to have to do is figure out a way to simplify that and make it clear for the homeowner.
Something important that they mentioned in this article, which I think people should be aware of, is that you should talk to the actual installer. In many environments, particularly in the residential solar installation company, salespeople don't necessarily work for the installer. They could be selling for 3 or 4 different entities that are out of state. They're not the ones who actually install it. They're not there locally. They don't understand the local. So make sure if you're buying something or you're investing this and you're considering third-party ownership, that you actually talk with the company that's going to be installing the project for you.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'll take that a step farther, Warren. You should have one company that does the sales, the development, the installation, and the O&M. One company the whole way through. And if it applies, that same company helps you with the grant applications or whatever else. That way, there's not finger pointing, because I think what can happen, Warren, is the sales guy can get the signature and he can say one thing, and then the installer comes in and installs it, but the installer doesn't understand the financing vehicle. They're just there to build it. They don't understand the background perhaps to the sale. They're just there to build what was designed. And then who's on the hook if something's not understood? It's the homeowner.
So these third-party ownership models they can be advantageous. I mean, 25% or around there right off the top, and an upfront savings is substantial. It essentially brings back the tax credit for homeowners, but they need to really understand what they're getting into, what they're giving up in terms of control for grid services, and then potentially what it looks like when that 5 or 6 year mark. How does that transfer? How does that ownership transfer happen? Are there fees involved at that or costs involved at that point? And how do you pay it off sooner if you don't want to continue to pay the interest rate over the 20 or 25 years? And what does that look like?
It's interesting, that you mentioned that, Warren. We really are bringing this extra incentive back into the residential space that residential systems alone are not eligible for. And I found it interesting. The article by NPR called "Tax Credits for Solar Panels Are Available, but the Catch is You Can't Own Them." Very fascinating to read that article and to see how companies like ours, who have not done residential leases and PPAs, very, very little, if any, in the past, are today, they're saying, this is really the only option that we have to stay in the residential space.
Right. And you can see that shift happening. They mentioned in that article that many installers are embracing this, but there's still those that, for example, that company in Arizona who are opposed to it. So it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds. And that being said, this model is relatively new in terms of penetrating all markets in the country. It's not available in all states right now. It looks like it's coming to quite a few states. And it also the program itself has a short window because the companies who own this still need to meet either the safe harbor guidelines. They need to be able to get the tax credit. And there's an end date to that as well for them.
So you either have permission to operate from the utility by end of 2027, or you need to have your project safe harbored before July 4th of 2026. And so a lot of these companies are probably going to safe harbor a lot of product to try to stretch those installs into 28, maybe even into 29, and stretch out as long as they can. And the article also mentioned, and we talked about this briefly before, Warren, but how important it is to not fall for high pressure sales tactics and door knockers. There are going to be companies that are trying to sell these products by knocking on doors and with high pressure sales tactics to try to get people to move. And again, it's important to have a company that does sales, installation, development, and O&M all in one company, and that doesn't pressure you into signing something that you don't understand.
Yeah. I think for me, the takeaway is if you're looking at a residential project, there's really no sense of urgency now. You have residential projects can take a matter of weeks, maybe a month or 2 or 3 to develop and install. And you've got at least until the end of 2027 to make that happen. So there should be no sense of urgency whatsoever on the residential side. Conversely, however, there is a sense of urgency on the commercial side. If you want to secure that tax credit, really you've got till July 3rd to make that decision and lock it in, or have your project installed before December 31st of 2027.
And I think that's a really good concluding point, Warren. Residential, take your time. There's a lot of complexity here. Figure it out. Make sure you understand it. Commercial, there's also complexity, but I feel like we've done our best to simplify it as much as possible so we can hit FIOC, we can hit domestic content, We can get everything safe harbored by, before July 4th. And then you have 4 years to go.
Absolutely. Super. A lot of interesting stuff, a lot to process here with FIOC and the deadline for commercial. And then if you're on the residential side, just take a deep breath. There's no sense of urgency. Make sure you understand everything. Talk to your local installers and find a company that you can put your trust and faith in and have them walk you through to make sure you get everything answered before you move forward with third-party ownership. Super. Well, that was a lot to cover, Larry. Appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks, Warren.
Thanks for watching this episode of The Solar Loop. Hit the like button and subscribe so you can stay in the loop on solar news, policy changes, and industry trends. You can explore more videos here on the Solar Energy channel and visit paradiseenergy.com to learn more about solar energy and what it could look like for you.